believe all of you should have received a copy of the Palaver series that gives you information about the coming series. If you don't, please make sure, we'll pass one out to you. Please make sure you get one, because there are actually two other very exciting, important sessions that we really don't want you to miss. On November the 10th, we have a session on AIDS transition, financing the fight against AIDS in Africa. That's on November the 10th. And then on November 16th, we have a colloquium in honor of Dr. Suleiman Yang, and we're going to have Dr. Ali Mazari, who's going to be here, and you don't want to miss that colloquium and that time. So please make sure you get one and stay posted. In addition, I hope that all of you did get a chance to sign the sheet here. This lets us know that you were here. Also, if you're not on the mailing list, we're able to put your email, send you a listing of the events as they come in. So please make sure you sign this. The Palaver series is an opportunity for us to discuss issues and policies affecting Africa today. And today, as you know, there are lots of issues in Africa that are important. But there probably isn't any issue as hot as the issue of China and Africa. And just in preparation for Dr. Park's talk, I'm going to just give you a couple things that I just quickly pulled up on the internet just to get an idea of how hot this topic is and just to set the pace. And I went to this site called China Africa News, and it had a very interesting article. Talked about the Dalai Lama not being allowed in September to visit South Africa. Dalai Lama, who's basically the head of the Tibet, and the relationship between China and Tibet is not as great as people would like to see it, but they denied the Dalai Lama permission to come to South Africa. Very interesting article, because it goes on and talk about that maybe this has something to do with China's investment in South Africa, which, by the way, in September was $2.5 billion. Then there was another interesting article on Zimbabwe, and this was in the Pambazuka. Very interesting article, because it talked about one of the generals in Mugabe's army had to go to China for an emergency health problem. And then it went on and talked about why this was important. The article pointed out that China was partners with the government of Zimbabwe in the mine development for diamonds valued at $800 billion. And that last month, the mine produced a record output of 1 million carats last month. So that's Zimbabwe, South Africa, but another really interesting one was some information I found about Angola. And of course, if you know anything about Angola and oil, you know that Angola is the second highest producer of oil behind Nigeria. And what was interesting is that it talked about, and this was an article that was found in News Time Africa, and it was in 2009, and it talked about the $2.4 billion investment that China made in Africa in its hydroelectric plant. What was interesting was the last sentence in the article, because it said, these loans have allowed Angola to bypass normal lending options provided by the IMF. Interesting. And the last one that I want to just make mention was, I thought, a very, very timely article, and it says, China-Africa Think Tank Forum holds first meeting today. The China-African Think Tank Forum held its first meeting in East China on Thursday, today, to discuss ways to promote political trust, economic cooperation, and cultural exchanges between China and Africa. So, I think you'd have to be living in a cave and never coming out not to realize that China, the issue of China and Africa is a very hot issue. And those who are researchers and who study this basically say it's going to continue to be a hot subject. So we're glad you're here, and I want to especially thank our professors, Dr. Serapion, Dr. Yang, Dr. Edgar, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Hailu, and Dr. Bond. There may be other doctors, and all you future doctors who are here. We're glad you're here, and we appreciate especially the professors and associate professors coming and supporting the Palaver series. It really is important. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zodi, who is the associate professor here in the African Studies Department here at Howard, and she's going to introduce Dr. Park and the topic today. Thank you. Dr. Zodi?
Thank you, Winston. I have to start by thanking the organizers of this Palaver series. It's been particularly active this year, and it's a big credit to those of you who have really kept up the legacy from years past. As Winston said, the topic of China is a very important topic simply because Africa has experienced any number of visitors and interveners over the centuries, and China is a strong part of that experience now. And it just happens that our department, as you know, had a big conference. Doesn't work. So, a big conference on this some 4 years ago. And some of us have taken a keen interest in that phenomena. So today, I'm very glad to introduce someone who shares this interest with us, looking at China-Africa relations. Dr. Yoon-Jung Park will be a visiting scholar in the Department of African Studies. And she has a rather impressive resume through which I will not go to a great extent, but she was born in South Korea, raised in California, Los Angeles, and lived in many places, including South Africa since 1995. I think it's at the end of 2010 you came back to the United States. So she's a prolific researcher. Her scholarship spans a great deal of subject matter areas, all related to Africa. I was interested to see that she's also interested in gender issues in Africa and the United States. And so her most recent research topic, I think, is African perceptions of Chinese in Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. So, I think you have done an extensive amount of field research on the basis of which she is publishing. So it's my pleasure, my honor to introduce her to you this afternoon. Dr.
I'm going to wait a second for Wheeler to come in and start. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Great. Okay. Okay, just a brief outline before I begin. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
It's not working. Is it coming through?
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, it's coming.
I didn't hear it.
Okay.
Hello? Oh, there it is.
Okay. Oh, we need this as well.
Yes.
Not going to echo. Hello? Oh. Do we need both of these?
Maybe not. Just sit this down here.
Is that better?
I'm the one's feedback right now.
Okay, no echo. Okay, just a quick outline of what I'm going to try to accomplish in the next about 35, 40 minutes. I'm going to give you a very brief background of Chinese in Africa, and then talk about this survey that I did with a number of field researchers in Maseru, in Lesotho, in Harare, in Zimbabwe, and in Johannesburg. And then kind of use the kind of No feedback.
Feedback?
Okay?
Can everyone hear? Okay.
Okay. Okay. So contemporary China-Africa relations actually started during the same time as Africa's independence movements. During this time, China became a friend to many of the newly independent states. They gave lots of aid and assistance during this period, and for example, they ended up giving a lot of help with Tazara, or the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. And there's a whole kind of literature that focuses on that period of China-Africa relations, but that's really the crux of where kind of contemporary relations lies. Okay. Then in the mid to late 90s, you have this renewed Chinese engagement with Africa, and this is what's led to a lot of new Chinese migration to the continent. So the big numbers that are getting tossed around, and a lot of the big numbers both in terms of migration as well as investments, all of that's really taken place only in the last 10 years. And so I think part of the reaction from the media, from the West, is in response to the rapid pace of Chinese interests and the growth of Chinese influence in Africa in a very short period of time. In terms of the actual migration, the numbers are really, really unreliable. And part of it is because the numbers are so fluid. A lot of the Chinese that come to Africa come in as contract laborers. And so they come in on these big construction projects, and they usually have 1 year, 2 year, maybe 3 year contracts, and they go back. Some number of those Chinese might decide they want to stay. And so they'll, after the completion of their contracts, they'll try to find a way to stay and get some money and invest in some kind of small business. But the numbers, again, are highly fluid. Most of the literature seems to argue that there are probably close to about 1 million Chinese in Africa today. And the numbers are concentrated in South Africa. South Africa probably has half of those in the entire continent. And then Madagascar, Mauritius, Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, and the numbers of Chinese in the DRC is also growing very, very rapidly. In every other African country, you're probably talking a few hundred to a few thousand at most. So very few other African countries have more than 10,000 Chinese at any given point. Okay. So during 2008, 2009, and 2010, we implemented a survey. Now, kind of my big caveat that I have to say before I go into this is I'm not a quantitative person. I really don't like questionnaires. I like sitting down and talking to people and interviewing them. I'm much more of a qualitative researcher. But I find that for things like getting a broad sense of perceptions, you can't always count on what the media is writing. You actually have to go and try to get a broad sense of what people are saying. So I had some colleagues who had done some research prior to mine looking at attitudes towards China at 10 different African universities. But that's also a very different kind of environment where you're just talking to university students and professors. And their attitudes probably don't represent those of the average people on the street. So what I wanted to do was get a sense of what your average South African was thinking about the Chinese. So I sent, we kind of tested a questionnaire focusing on attitudes and perceptions of Chinese. What do you think of them? How often do you engage with them? And things like that. And then we, with kind of strict instructions that they were to kind of get a broad range across race, age, class. They were supposed to go to the high-end malls in Sandton and walk around in Soweto interviewing police officers and street vendors and the like. So we did kind of as best as we could. Even so, I can't say that my survey is representative of all attitudes of Chinese, of Africans in these 3 cities about Chinese, but it combined with the qualitative interviews that I've done and the archival research and kind of the scanning of media articles, I still feel that these surveys are useful. And And to the best of my knowledge, no one else has done anything even close to this. So we did this in Maseru, in Harare, and in Johannesburg. Approximately 200 surveys were completed in each, and rather than hand out surveys to people, I actually had the field researchers sit and basically do a quick interview and kind of tick off the answers and things. So that's the basis of this, the first part of this paper. And I haven't had a chance to really do any in-depth analysis yet, but what this paper is based on is just a preliminary glimpse at some of the numbers. And what was so shocking to me really is the huge difference in attitudes and perceptions about Chinese in these 3 different cities. You can go to the next one. So the preliminary comparative analysis indicates that Basotho, in the smallest of the countries surveyed, are much more critical, much more concerned about China and Chinese migrants than South Africans or Zimbabweans. For example, we asked a question about the impact of China's rising power on Africa, and 67 of the Basotho interviewed actually said it was potentially harmful versus close to 30% of the South Africans. Is China a neo-colonial power? And that's one of the frames that's commonly used in media portrayals of China in Africa. 95% of the Basotho strongly agreed or agreed versus 65% of the South Africans. Next slide. With regard to the Chinese migrants in these respective countries, 75% of the Basotho indicated that they disagreed or strongly disagreed that increased Chinese migration would benefit their country, versus only 25.7% of the South Africans. 43.5% of the Basotho indicated that Chinese small businesses were, at least to some degree, harmful to locals and or to local economic development. And this can be compared to 26.3% of the South Africans and 12% of the Zimbabweans. Okay, and if you can just keep in mind, during this time, one of the things that Wheeler read earlier was about China in Zimbabwe and the way Mugabe has kind of established an entire policy of looking east and indicating that the ZANU-PF and China are kind of best friends like this. So you would expect the Zimbabweans generally, because of Mugabe's lack of popularity, to be much angrier and much more upset about the presence of Chinese, and in fact that's not the case. And then when we asked people to describe the actual Chinese migrants, this was interesting because it seemed like most Africans were able to distinguish between kind of China as this big monolithic power and the Chinese migrants that they were encountering. So most seem to agree that Chinese were hardworking. Over 30% in Lesotho, over 40% in South Africa, and close to 66% in Zimbabwe agreed to that statement. Many also found Chinese to be disciplined, but again, look at the difference in the figures. Just over 5% in Lesotho versus over 30% in Zimbabwe. And then, on the more negative side, nearly half of all the Basotho also found the Chinese were unfriendly and or racist, whereas only 9.2% of South Africans said this, and less than 2% of Zimbabweans had the same feelings. Okay. And then the final kind of thing that I picked up in this preliminary scan of the differences is that the degree of engagement or contact between groups. And in Lesotho, the Basotho, almost 70% of the Basotho had daily contact with Chinese, daily contact. And another 20% said they saw them at least once a week. Okay, this is an extremely high level of face-to-face contact. In contrast, only less than 5% of Zimbabweans said they saw Chinese daily and 3% weekly, and the vast majority, over 90%, said they didn't see them very often. Okay, and this kind of runs contrary to typical assumptions that greater contact, right, will engender kind of greater understanding and greater cohesion. Let me just leave the surveys at that and then go on to try to understand what's actually going on. Okay. I think it's important when we try to examine data from surveys like that to try to understand both globally and locally what's the context, what are we dealing with here. And with regard to kind of a broader context, one of the things that is quite evident from all of the media articles, again, if you do what Wheeler did and just kind of type in China, Africa, you'll get hundreds, tens of thousands of hits, and most of them will be talking about how China is kind of increasingly powerful and both globally as well as increasingly important and influential in Africa. China is now the biggest trading partner for most African countries. China, on the positive side, provides an alternative for African leaders and for African governments to the West and to the World Bank and IMF, and particularly to the conditionalities that they put on these African countries. And there's growing evidence, if you look at, for example, Deborah Brautigam, a colleague who's based at American University, has a book out called The Dragon's Gift. And if you look at her readings or any number of recent studies, there's growing evidence that Africa has experienced economic growth and development in the last 5 to 10 years. Even during the economic downturn, it's experienced higher growth than most of the rest of the world. And that's in no small part due to China purchasing natural resources and China's engagement, both in terms of trade and aid and development aid and assistance. So that's kind of the positive end of things. But there's also at the same time a growing kind of signs of historically in this country what was called yellow peril journalism. The fear of China, the fear of a strong China. And this is particularly clear if you look at any of the newspapers in the US and in the UK. And the framing of the discourse is around China as a competitor to the US in Africa. So Africa is this, almost this kind of thing, this place to be plundered, right? And who's going to get there first, and who's going to get the best goodies, and who's going to get the best deals. And that's the way the argument is typically framed in the US media, even by some, pretty high kind of end journalists who write for places like The Atlantic. China is often portrayed as a neo-colonial or neo-imperial power. It's constantly referred to as being resource-hungry, resource-starved, and absolutely without morality. There are constant talks about the human rights abuses in China, the lack of concern about labor, environment, and kind of the stealing, raping, pillaging of Africa for its mineral and natural resources and its oil reserves and its timber. The other groups that tend to be highly, highly critical of China, almost